I'm going to focus on two things. One is going to be copper, and the other is going to be on EVs. I know we spoke on an EV panel earlier. I'd like to expand upon a few things that I was talking about there. So I may stray a bit from copper when I get to that. And again, my name is Ken Hoffman. I run our global EV research practice at McKinsey for the materials side of things. I also look at megatrends for particularly copper and gold. Let me first start with sort of big issues for the copper industry as investors, what you should look at and where things sort of are going. And we have a service called MineSpans, which looks at cost for every single mine in the world. We have 100% coverage out through 2028. And the one thing you'd want to know when you're looking at cost for the copper industry is the world's biggest producer is obviously Chile. And we look at Chile going forward, their costs are going to have a huge problem going forward. Their mines are getting older, their mines are getting deeper, the mines are getting more expensive, and they have a huge problem with arsenic, which will cause them problems. And Chile does, Codelco in particular, does a sort of an interesting thing where all revenues from Codelco pretty much go back to the government, and then for their CapEx, they sort of ask the government for the money back. And you know, one thing you've seen a lot of resource nationalism in the world, there's always the fear that the government may say, hey, we're not going to give you the money you're asking for, particularly as it's constantly rising. And the longer gold prices stay, you know, at levels where they are today, 5,700 a metric ton, the more pressure I think it's being put on countries like Chile, who both, number one, need that money internally, and number two, you know, it's probably getting a harder ask for Codelco every time they have to go back asking for even more money and saying, hey, but the price keeps dropping. So that's going to be one thing really to watch. Peru, on the other hand, is looking pretty good on the cost curve. You can see they're sort of slightly moving down that cost curve. A lot of good development going on in Peru. And so that's sort of a better country in terms of long-term outlook. Overall, if we look at, you know, China always becomes, you know, something to look at. And the one thing in terms of sort of short-term and long-term, we spent a lot of time looking at China's recycling rate. We started to be asked about a year and a half ago about copper recycling in China, particularly from big mining companies out of Singapore who trade in the iron ore space. And what they were saying was China had made about 4 or 5 years ago, some pretty big changes in steel recycling, saying, you know, we're going to keep out foreign steel, it's polluting, you know, we're going to develop our own scrap recycling industry. And the numbers coming out of the Chinese market were far, far higher than anybody at the mining companies had thought. And so they came back to us and said, okay, it looks like China's doing the exact same thing in base metal recycling. Can you talk to us about, you know, how great that could be? We've done quite a bit of work on Chinese recycling, and the first thing you want to figure out when you're trying to do a recycling rate is what is their pool of potential resources that can come back into the market. China's is incredibly high. The second thing you're wanting to know is, well, how quickly can that copper sort of come out of that recycling pool into the marketplace? A couple interesting things about China. Their buildings, I don't know if they're not made as well, but they don't last as long. They tend to replace their buildings far faster than countries do in the West. In fact, it's pretty considerable less. You're talking about 5 to 7 years less than the average life of a Chinese building versus a building in the West. And a lot of it has to do with, particularly in their major cities, they're just constantly ripping down apartment buildings and building up newer, bigger, better buildings, and so that's that constant turnover. Number one, it keeps a lot of people employed in the construction industry, and number two, it sort of shortens the life of their buildings and brings that material back into the marketplace. China did institute, so as of, I believe, January, all foreign imports of copper scrap in particular will be banned unless you have a special dispensation from the government. They started this loosely in July. And we have seen imports of copper really drop considerably. Interesting, a couple different things. Number one, China used to import a lot of scrap and all sorts of waste materials from the United States. And so what we've seen here is municipalities who used to be paid for their metal, plastic, scrap, et cetera, now have to pay massive increases. And I actually went to my local municipality and I said, how much did we used to get money? And they said, we used to be break even or $50 a ton for our metal and plastic scrap. Now we have to pay $400 to $500 a metric ton. And if we landfill it, the cost is between 50 and 100. So what you've seen massively happen in particularly North America is just we're going back to landfills and just dumping everything in there. It's just far cheaper. Municipalities can't afford to have their material recycled. So while China is turning away all this scrap, a lot of it isn't going someplace else. It's going into the earth just to be recycled. Europe has a different philosophy. They're using what they call cradle-to-grave recycling. So if I make a product in Europe now, I sort of have to go to the regulator and say, if I make an EV, or if I make just a regular internal combustion engine car, this is where I got it. First of all, this is where I sourced my material from. So I have to tell you exactly where it got it from, so it wasn't sort of mined irresponsibly. I have to show you in the product, and then I also have to tell you at the end of life, this is what's going to happen to it. So I'm going to, if it's a battery, this is how I'm going to recycle it, or this is how I'm going to reuse it, but I have to have a plan. And when we meet automotive companies around the world, I often go with a partner who's head of the automotive practice, and we have a side bet. Will be the first, second, or third question from the C-suite of the auto company about recycling, and it's always the first, second, or third question. You know, what do you guys have about recycling, and how do we recycle this stuff, and everything else? It's very top of mind for every automotive company in particular, and I heard the same is true for appliance companies, et cetera. So it's pretty interesting how that's doing. And in Europe, they don't want to ship anything out. They want to make sure all that material stays in-house and has a gigantic loop going around and around. Sustainability is a very, very big thing in Europe, as is decarbonization. So in terms of China, since they're canceling all imports of copper scrap, what you're going to see, and you started to see this already, was they just don't have the systems in place today to generate that scrap. It's sort of sitting there right now. So you've seen a very large increase in concentrate imports. And so that's been a big issue for them. And we think that's going to occur for the next 3 to 5 years, that you're actually going to see very strong copper demand for concentrates going into China. However, once we get beyond 5 years, we've already started to see the copper scrap price inside of China rise significantly relative to pure metal from virgin raw material. And we think that's going to encourage the setting up of recycling systems within China. So as we get really beyond 2025, you're going to see a huge deluge of recycled material come into the marketplace, and that will start to hurt long-term copper demand from China. If you're a big bull on copper, you hope that by then India is really the next market that a lot of people think you'll see growth in, and that will start to offset some of that losses. But that's sort of what we've seen going on with recycling. Overall, if we look at the global cost curve and new mines coming online, it's pretty scattered across the cost curve where new mines are coming into these new mines. On the top, you can see the orange and red are where you're going to see mines closed or big reductions. And the green on the bottom line is going to see the new mines coming in. And you can see most of them are sort of in middle or low end of the cost curve. So net, you're actually you're going to see an overall lower price in terms of cost. However, the C90, which a lot of people believe drives sort of the bottom end of copper prices, would actually rise quite significantly from around 4,600 today to about 5,400. And why the C90 is so important is those are the mines that could first be closed if the price were to get that low. And so that's sort of where we are today. So we currently at 56, 5,700, while it's a low copper price, we don't think it's inducive to close any mines just yet. Overall demand, if we look at where demand's going, we see slow and steady growth for overall copper demand. EVs, and I'm going to talk a bit about that, become a bigger and bigger part of the puzzle. But overall, we continue to see pretty good growth from around 25 million metric tons this year, up to about 31.5 by 2027, but slow and steady as she goes with copper demand. And so we think while we do see some reduction in copper demand and recycling and things of that nature, we actually see that being offset in particular by electric vehicles. Now let's talk a little bit about electric vehicles. As we sort of talked on the panel, for those who were there for that, EVs are fine, thank you. They're growing really well. And as I said, you're already through August this year, we're up more than 40% over last year in global EV sales. And while September was a cruddy month for certain, I think you're still going to see pretty good growth in EVs going forward. If you look at the launches, 2020 is going to be a pretty big year for EV launches, and really every year after 2020, you should probably see anywhere between 50 and 100 new models of electric vehicles being launched in the world. Again, what they're looking for, what the consumer is looking for, is for the longest possible range and the quickest possible recharge time. And so you're starting to see that actually competitively. So if you look at sort of the Taycan, I think the recharge time on that's pretty darn quick. I think it's under a half an hour. You can get a full charge from zero. Whereas if you look at some things like the e-tron and the I-Pace, which came out about a year ago, they have not sold well, mainly because they don't have much range, 250 miles or less, and they take a long time to charge, and those just won't work. Tesla is by far the industry leader in terms of charge time and range, and that's why they continue to sell really, really well. Again, we talked about this on the panel a bit. What's driving, sort of the continued growth, particularly Europe? And look, if the U.S. government has a new president next year, at least the platform for most of the Democratic candidates is quite bullish for EVs. This is the numbers I talked about. Between 22 and 30% of all EVs will be, of all cars sold will be EVs by 2030. You can see the greatest proportion of that will be in the dark blue line, which is pure battery material, battery cars. And we often get the question, well, what about hybrids? Hybrids long-term don't really work. And I'll give this example. In August, in the UK, there is officially more charging stations there are petrol stations or pumps. And so what you're going to see is petrol stations, by their very nature, are very low-margin businesses. And as you see more and more EVs out there, particularly in Europe, watch for a lot of these petrol stations to start closing. So people are starting to think, wait, now I have to drive, a couple, 5-6 miles for an open petrol station. I'd rather just charge it someplace else. And so the pain point for using petrol will become such an issue that probably sort of switches over to EVs and even quickens the pace of EV development. And at the end of the day, the battery development is becoming so fast at this point in time. You're going to get everything you want in that battery. You're going to get a very quick charge time, and you're going to get the range you want. And again, that's just something that I think you can't stop this train at this point. One thing I want to talk about copper demand, and this is something I wanted to sort of dispel, is a couple of the big mining companies have talked at conferences that there's 4 times as much copper in a battery car than there is an internal combustion engine. That was true 6-7 years ago. It is definitely not true today. As we said, we rip apart a lot of EVs, and what we're finding is the auto companies who are great at reducing cost are reducing cost. And so you're probably talking around 2.2 to 2.3 times the amount of copper in an EV versus an internal combustion engine today. If battery technology changes, that number could actually drop to 1-to-1. We'll go through a little bit of that. Here's where the copper is, and you do have access to these slides. What's interesting here is that very last line. If you look at BEVs, the majority of the copper in an EV comes in actually the battery itself. So what you have is you'll have, so what is a battery? You have an anode and a cathode. The cathode is what everybody talks about because that's where your nickel, cobalt, manganese is going to be. Your anode, nobody really talks about, but it's graphite. That really isn't even an investable space. And then the lithium is sort of what dopes it, and the lithium's going back and forth. And to take the charge away, you usually have a thin sheet of copper. Today it's about 6 microns thick, but some people are coming out with 4 micron thick material, so you're taking a lot of copper out. And then you sort of layer it. So you have a bunch of layers, and then you have a copper layer, and then you have an aluminum layer after another cathode anode, and they sort of work through the battery. And so all of this sits in a liquid electrolyte, which is highly flammable. And that's sort of the problem with batteries is if you have a short in that battery, you get a YouTube video of your car on fire. So that's where the material is. But as I said, they're trying to take a lot out. This is what I talked about in the panel. What I really want to talk about, where are we in battery technology? If we look, sorry, I'll speak loudly. I'm sorry for the camera. Where are we today? We're right here in sort of battery technology. So if we look back at the Nissan Leaf, we used a graphite anode, fully graphite. We have a separator, and then we have your cathode, which cathode could be a bunch of different materials. This is what we're talking about, your LFP, which is basically an iron lithium battery, etc. This is what's important, is the energy density number. The number is about 100 watts per kilo weight of the material. Today we're looking at sort of best-in-class anode, which is still predominantly graphite, up to 5% silicon. So silicon is great. It can hold about 10 times the charge of graphite, and that's fantastic. The problem is when silicon is fully charged, it expands by 300%. And the expansion and contraction as it gets electrons and gives up electrons sort of breaks the battery apart. So the battery doesn't last very long. You still have a separator today, and then you have your cathode. Again, since nickel holds the electric, that's why you're going to the 622 and 811s. And Tesla's 92% nickel in the cathode material. Cathode material, getting to this 811, we're pretty much there. I mean, we're trying to get a little bit more nickel in. We're trying to get other material out. But most of the new sort of technology is looking at the anode. How do we get graphite out? And as I said, the first thing we're doing is to put silicon in. So there are people working on a silicon anode. It would be a lot lighter. It would hold a lot more electricity. Again, trying to get over the issue of expandability has been the big problem. The other metal being used is lithium metal. If I'm a chemist, I want to see lithium metal because your lithium that you actually have floating around in that electrolyte would like to go to lithium. It's sort of perfectly attracted. The problem with lithium is it reacts to, I think, 99.8% of all known materials out there, and so it tends to degrade very rapidly. But lithium is incredibly light, and you're probably taking about half the weight of the battery out if you were able to have a lithium anode. Where we go from here is going to be pretty interesting. Again, the idea is, how do I increase that number at the very bottom is the watts per kilo. There was some interesting research put out by Jeffrey Don. Jeffrey Don is like the godfather of new batteries, and he works very closely with Panasonic and Tesla. He is looking at, and this is what scares the bejesus out of the European car makers, he's looking at sort of, a lot of people thought we would go from the battery of today to something called solid state. Solid state is what you hear a lot in the marketplace. Why is solid state so great? Because you get rid of that highly flammable electrolyte, and you replace it with something solid, be it a silicon or a glass. If there's nothing to catch fire, there is no more YouTube videos. It's a very safe product, and therefore, wow, this is really, really great. And there also was a thought that if you take out the electrolyte, which could be reactive with the lithium metal, you could then replace, you could put in that lithium anode. So you'd have a much more efficient, much smaller battery. Problem is liquid's great because it attaches like it's sort of touching everything, whereas a glass or a silicon won't be touching perfectly. There's always like little ridges where little bubbles where you won't actually touch, and so the connectivity to get that lithium back and forth would be compromised. Jeffrey Don's research that came out a few weeks ago said, you know what, guys, I'm not going to go fully solid state. I'm going to continue to use a type of electrolyte. And I'm going to make a bigger battery than what Tesla currently does. But I found a way to use lithium metal in the anode, which takes out tremendous amounts of weight. The numbers they're talking to, so today, best in class, energy density has risen from that 100 from a couple of years ago to today, you're probably talking anywhere from 220 to 300. Our chemists will really argue over what that number is. CATL has announced commercially a 304 watt per kilo battery. But again, you're talking 6 times the energy density of a battery from just 3-4 years ago. So that's how quickly we've been moving. Don is sort of talking 400 to 500 watts per kilo. And why is that really, really important? It's really, really important because number one, it gets you to the holy grail. And the holy grail of EVs is a 1,000-kilometer car. If I could have a car that can go 1,000 kilometers, or about, 600 miles, I maybe only have to charge once a month. Charge time becomes a lot less important, but there are a lot of charging technologies. And probably the car of 2025, most likely you'll see a 1,000-kilometer charge car that charges in about 5 minutes. At that point in time, it's game over for the internal combustion engine. Because once you have an electric vehicle, and 95% of people who buy an electric vehicle continue to buy an electric vehicle. Why? No more oil changes. No more brake pads. You don't need brakes. If you've ever been in a, let me say, electric golf cart, and you take your foot off the electric golf cart, it immediately stops. It's the same thing true with an electric car, because what happens when you take your foot off the gas, immediately you generate, all that forward motion is generated into electrical energy back into the battery. So your batteries on an electric vehicle get more than a 1,000,000-kilometer range. So you don't change your batteries. No more transmissions. Even the tires can last longer because of the low center of gravity that these cars have. Your tires actually last longer. So car companies actually detest electric vehicles because it destroys their service market. Remember, if I have an EV, and why car companies hate electric vehicles is because there goes all my dealerships. My dealerships make all their money in service. There's nothing to service. These things are really, it's a freaking battery. I mean, you replace the battery. There's your big thing. And how often does that happen? Tesla's already talking about a 1.6 million kilometer battery warranty. And so, they don't make money on new cars. I really hope not, because I need to buy a new car soon. They make a little bit of money on used cars. They make a lot of money on service. So once you take the service away from them, there goes all your dealership change. So they don't like it for that. Plus, they make a lot of money on the extra parts and everything else. There's no real parts here. The biggest thing that scares all these automotive companies at the end of the day is autonomous. Because if I had an autonomous car here in New York City, and we figured out the cost of running an autonomous electric vehicle would be about 15 cents a mile. At 15 cents a mile, if I were Amazon or Google or Apple or Facebook, how about I provide you a free car service? Now, I'm stealing your data left, right, and center every second you're in that car. But the value of that data is worth a lot more than the 15 cents a mile that I'm charging you. So I'll give it to you free. I'll just make 1 million of these cars. They'll have no identity. They'll be little pods or something. Doesn't matter. The cheapest way to make it possible. I'm getting free service. Why would I pay for something if I could get it for free? What happens to the car companies at that point? And since there's so few moving parts in an electric vehicle, anybody can make these. I mean, look, Tesla has not been showing they can make these cars very well. And yet they do fine, right? I mean, who doesn't want to buy a Tesla these days? So, if Apple says, hey, we got, a couple $1 billion in cash, why don't we just make the Apple car? It'd be super easy, it'd be super high tech, it'd be driverless, and it'd be free. And that, at the end of the day, really, really scares the automotive industry. So what they're trying to do right now is, how can we differentiate ourselves? That's why you won't see one battery for all cars, because if every car gets 500-kilometer range and every car charges in 10 minutes or something, what's the difference? Why should I pay 3 times or 4 times more for my BMW or Mercedes versus my Volkswagen? I'll get the freaking same car. It all has the same technology. Technology is technology. So that's why you'll see a differentiation in battery technology, so they can say, the Porsche Taycan now has 1,500 kilometers. Et cetera. And that's why you've seen even Tesla come out with the Founder Series, which you can buy for a $250,000 cash deposit, which has a 1,000-kilometer range today. And so that's how you're going to see it. So the pushing up the curve of the battery technology is going to be very fast and very furious. And remember, as we get into these heavier and heavier batteries, in terms of energy density, that's where you start to see a lot of the stationary stuff become really cool. Go online and look at the Tesla power plant that they built in Australia. It got a lot of fanfare. It was a $150 million project. Elon Musk famously said, if I can't build it in 100 days or less, it'll be free. I think he put it up in 60 days. But if you look at it, the thing is massive, right? And okay, it's this huge thing in the middle of the desert. Okay, it powers 10,000 homes for 4 hours. So it's not the real solution. What that plant really does do is they had a very inefficient, or I guess they would see a lot of surges in their battery system there, which would constantly cause brownouts and blackouts in the Australian system. Batteries are instantaneous. So it's like 0.00000 seconds. It gives energy into the system. So whenever you used to see the spikes in energy demand in Australia, that's where Tesla's system comes in. They're called peaker plants, and you're seeing a lot of that in the US as well. They only hold about 4 hours of power. I was in China, and I met with one of their largest wind companies. And I'm a stupid American, so I say, it's windy outside. Yay, you guys are happy, right? And I figured I'd break the ice with the Chinese. And they're like, no. The wind today is more than 20 kilometers an hour. It's horrible. I'm like, you're a wind company. Like, wouldn't you want wind? And they're like, no, once wind goes above about 20 kilometers an hour, we start shutting down our windmills because the pipe that takes electricity away from our wind farms can only hold so much. And so they start shutting everything down, so they're lost all this energy. If we had on site this gigantic battery, then we can have a second pipe that would just put all that energy into there and then give us 24-hour-a-day power to put into the grid. That's why you need the energy density. And that's why if you start seeing this density really start to rise and you start looking at these very advanced batteries that have more than 1,000 watts per kilo, you really start talking about things that change the system and go out there. Now, from a renewable standpoint, wind and solar is far cheaper than pretty much anything except U.S. natural gas. You can talk all you want about coal. Nobody in their right mind would put up a coal plant. It's way too expensive. It's way, way too expensive. Solar and wind is far, far cheaper in your kilowatt hour, and it drops constantly. So the problem the solar and wind guys has is the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't come out. That's what the battery technology will gap, and that's why everyone's trying to rush here and why it's going to be such a massive, massive business. So that's what you really want to watch for. Now, at the end of the day, from an investor standpoint, all along here, unless we get to the oxygen-based batteries, which it's hard to tell if the air batteries work or don't work, but the cathode remains that nickel, cobalt, manganese. Cobalt's the one that a lot of people are wondering about. So why do I have cobalt in a battery? I have nickel there to hold the charge. Manganese is sort of there to stabilize things a little bit. And cobalt was thought to be into the battery to sort of stabilize the structure. Like there's a layering structure in the battery, and was thought cobalt was needed to stabilize that structure. Another report by Jeffrey Don took all the cobalt out of batteries and just said, what happens? And not much happened at all. I think there was a little bit loss of power, and that's why Tesla has 2.8% cobalt. They just don't think they need it. So from that standpoint, I think all the batteries being planned for the next 4 or 5 years are all cobalt-based. I think you're fine, but I think longer term, you'd be concerned, is cobalt really necessary? Again, in 2012, there was less than 50,000 EVs sold in the world. Today, there'll be 3 million. The industry has grown from nothing in a second. No one's really looked into this stuff. There's never been a big incentive, except now, to put billions and billions of dollars into research. So we're learning stuff constantly. And as we learn things really, really fast, we're like, do we really need this stuff? Nickel, I think we know we need. Where do things go? We often ask, all right, so buy nickel. Nickel's going to go crazy forever. Yes and no. Nickel's going to be used great, and nickel's great because it holds electrons fantastically. Manganese actually also holds electrons fantastically, but manganese doesn't like to give up or take electrons very, very fast, and that's why you don't see it in a big usage. The car industry loves manganese because the nickel industry, class 1 nickel is about 1.5 million metric tons. The manganese industry is 25 million metric tons. When I start thinking about making 30, 40, 50, 60 million units a year, let alone stationary storage, manganese really excites these industries. But we have to solve that technological problem. We think the way you'll solve that problem is a product called graphene. Graphene is a two-dimensional man-made substance that's created a lot of hype. If you want to have fun on a night and want to watch a TED Talk, just do graphene TED Talk. You'll knock your socks off. Graphene's really good because it's frictionless when it comes to electrons. So electrons pass through it 10 times better than copper. What you could do is dope the manganese with graphene to take in those electrons quicker and give up those electrons quicker. Because if you had a manganese battery and you hit the gas pedal in your electric car, it would go about 2 miles an hour. But if you had something like a graphene, that would probably be your long term. And that's really going out there long term. And that's probably people asked when cobalt was 100,000, oh, is cobalt going to 200,000? We would say, I've been in this industry for over 25 years. The cure for high prices always is high prices. And that's exactly what we saw. When people started to see high prices for cobalt, the cobalt started to be thrifted out of the batteries. There had been, the market had been pretty much controlled by a few players. They sort of lost control. That caused the price to go way up and then the price to collapse. Lithium, there is plenty of lithium out there. Lithium metal is a really interesting thing, so I don't worry about finding lithium. I'm worried about finding the right type of lithium product for my material. Nickel, if nickel were to go to 50, 60, 70,000, everyone would be jumping for joy. I'm sure there'd be a lot of money to be made, but that's the worst thing to happen long term because these chemists would find ways to move on from nickel and go to probably something called manganese. And so that's probably the progression of materials you start to see over time. I'll stop there for a second. Are there any questions on this? I know there's been a lot of talk about batteries and stuff, but I'm more than happy. Any questions? No? I'll keep going. I'm just showing you a couple.
Ken, we've actually gone. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just here.
Oh, go ahead.
When will electric vehicle costs come down to where ICE costs are, and is that a consideration for consumers at all?
So the industry is trying to get you to think about cars in a different way. First of all, you can go to Europe today, buy a Hyundai Kona, which has level 3 driving, which is pretty much like Tesla. You can go on a highway and it'll drive itself. It will give you between 560 and 600 kilometer range, so 275 to 315, whatever it is in miles. And the cost is about 30,000 euros. So, and once you own that Hyundai Kona and why it's sold out for pretty much forever, as I said, the total cost of ownership, electricity is far cheaper, even in real high-cost electricity companies, it's far cheaper than petrol. And then all the ancillary, you're never going to need an oil change, you're never going to need brake change, you're never going to need transmission. The overall life of cost is way, way lower. There's a lot of people wondering, will you just see a lot more leasing? Because they can charge a higher price, but if they lease it to you and constantly are changing over the cars, that will work out. But you will start to hear this phrase TCO, or total cost of ownership, and that's showing today your car. So a Tesla would pretty much be cheaper on a total cost of ownership of anything else out there. The purchase price up front, let's say I'm looking for a car and I'm like, the EV guy should buy a Tesla, right? They make it really hard to buy. Like, they won't buy your car from you, and I have a car, and I don't want to go sell my car. And they have a lease, they have a purchase price, but they only have like one purchase price or one lease rate. So whereas the automotive, I think they need to advance themselves in the commercial side of things. Even so, they're sold out, so they don't care. But I think you'll see that. And like I said, you start to see, look at the Volkswagen ID3, the model coming out next year. It's called the ID3. It gets 600, I think, kilometers in the long range. It's going to cost about 40,000 US. Again, the cost of it, probably leasing will be the main way. And I think most people, again, the big thing is there are green people who will go out and buy anything, because we want to be green. They're always the first adopters. It's what is the regular automotive buyer looking for? And again, we've done a bunch of surveys. The interesting thing is about 90% of people today said they would consider an electric vehicle, at least look at it. And that's up from about 60% 2 years ago and up from about 15% 5 years ago. So the numbers has exploded. But again, when they come to actually look at the EVs, there isn't a lot of choice. If you don't go into Tesla, if you go into most other car dealers, most dealerships themselves will never push the EV because the dealership doesn't want to push these things that will never come back for service. So we've done a lot of mystery shopper stuff where we get the dealership saying, oh, that looks great, but come on over here. That's a great internal combustion engine car. And so I think there's some things that need to change. But also what you're going to need at the end of the day is give me that range that I have now. I don't. Why would I take anything worse? So my range is 800 to 900 kilometers today. I want a car that goes 800, 900 kilometers. I can charge this thing in 5 minutes in any gas pump. I want something that charges 5 minutes in any gas pump. And I think you're seeing that. We actually had, it was a great question. When I was at the Advanced Automotive Battery Conference in San Diego, we had a firm come to us to say, we have a technology proven by automotive companies. They're private companies, so you can't invest in them, but it increases the charge time tenfold, so about 5-minute charge times. And their question was, how much do we charge for that technology? It was sort of interesting. And at first, our partner was like, who I was with was like, a lot. But then he was like, what is a lot? And that's what a lot of these companies are trying to figure out is like, how do we even charge for these cars? how much will you pay extra for charge time versus overall cost versus an internal combustion engine? The technologies are all coming out, but I think a lot of the car companies are like, how do we figure this out? How do we charge for it? What's the advancement? Do we give every single car fast charging, or only the high-end cars fast charging, and then et cetera? So I think these are all the questions coming out. Again, for a mining conference, we care most about what materials they'll use. And again, nickel, lithium, and copper are sort of the interesting ones. This just shows how the weight has been dropped. This is a Model S versus a Model 3. You can see the different cords and stuff, but taking huge amounts of weight out of the car in terms of copper usage. I think if we look overall, yes, I'll go through that. Chargers, that's another big question. As I said, in the UK, they have more chargers than petrol stations right now, public ones. China has around 10 times as many chargers per electric vehicle as does the United States. That's something you're going to probably see changing. But again, this is stuff that a lot of investments, a lot of stuff is going on here. And the interesting thing about charge points, they don't really use a lot of copper. We've actually torn down a bunch of these fast chargers. They only use about 2 to 5 kilos of copper. The other question we get an awful lot is, can the power system handle this? Yes, no problem whatsoever. In fact, because of all the energy saving stuff we've been doing with lights and everything else, most utilities are looking for power demand. And so that's an issue.
There's
one last question before and I've run out of time, sorry.
Can you talk briefly about hydrogen?
Fuel cells. The main problem for fuel cells is this. A 400 kilowatt Tesla recharge station costs about $75,000 to install. A hydrogen station today costs between $2.5 and $3 million. And the single biggest thing, fuel cells are a great technology. The whole problem is the hydrogen cost of delivery and how to have ample number of stations put up for that price. And until, it's really not a technology issue, I think, anymore for the fuel cell. It's the delivery cost. I know California's tried and they've stopped. I think they put 30 million into hydrogen stations, and I think their cost went a lot more than 3 million per station. Germany's trying to do it somehow. The question is, if EV technology is advancing as fast as it is, has fuel cells sort of lost their day? They had it probably, there's so much hype in the 90s about this. I almost wonder if they moved too slow. And now it's sort of might be too late. All right, thank you very
Great stuff.
much.
Thank you, Ken.